We'll be looking at Africa's winners and losers in business at the close of 2014 and their prospects next year. Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa, the last one for 2014. Would you believe that? 100 plus programs into the year so far. As usual, we have a usual half-hour mix of all the key business news stories you need to know about from across the African continent. Here's what's coming up. There's a sigh of relief in Uganda's inflation drops, albeit marginally. And in our special series, we'll be looking at how gold mining has been affected by poor power supplies in South Africa. Let's start in East Africa, Uganda to be specific, where the country's year-on-year inflation rate eased in December as food prices fell even further in that month. According to Uganda's Bureau of Statistics, headline inflation was down to 1.8% in the year to December from 2.1% in November. Now, even though core inflation, which excludes food, electricity and metered water, went up to 2.7% from 2.3%, Leon Sanyange has the details.
The latest figures may have come as good news for what was a good economic year in Uganda. Annual inflation figures have gradually dropped throughout the year from 7.1% in March down to 1.4% in September. However, there was a slight increase to 2.1% in November due to high food prices. Despite this, the central bank has warned that shortfalls in the global economy would impact efforts to further bring down the figures.
The weaknesses in the global economy could undermine growth prospects in Uganda, in particular through their impact on demand for Uganda's exports and inward flows of foreign direct investment.
Now, financial experts predict that inflation rates could decrease further in the new year. But there are also fears that increased public spending in the run-up to Uganda's national elections in early 2016 may stoke up inflation in 2015. Leon Sanyange, CCTV, Kampala.
Now, over in South Africa, a fairly large part of the narrative in that country in the second half of the year has been defined by two words: power load shedding. So Mr. Naidu filed this report looking at how these power cuts are affecting Sibanye Gold.
Eskom has been forced to pull the plug on its integrated demand management program. The initiative, which has been running for 10 years now, encourages individuals and businesses to save electricity through the use of energy-efficient technologies such as solar and power-saving light bulbs.
4,000 megawatts in the South African context it's about 15% of our total electricity demand. It could power a city the size of Cape Town and the surrounding metros. Most countries in Africa would use less than 4,000 megawatts.
Eskom has been working with big industrial customers to improve efficiency in their operations and use less power. The mining industry accounts for 15% of the country's energy usage. At least half of that is used by the gold miners. Sibanye Gold is one of the largest individual gold producers locally and one of the top 10 in the world. It produces almost 45,000 kilograms of ore a year.
We consume about 500 megawatts of energy. We are a key customer to Eskom, and we use about 1.5% of the available energy that Eskom produces.
Productions at Sibanye were severely hit when Eskom's power crisis first hit back in 2008.
Since that time, we have been partaking in energy-efficient projects, load shift project and energy-efficient projects, and ever since then we've saved 2 to 3% per year. Our electricity consumption has come down from about 550 megawatts. It's currently sitting at around 430 megawatts.
Most of Sibanye's operations are underground. Compressed air systems and pumping water accounts for more than half of the mine's electricity usage.
The compressed air system is hundreds of kilometers worth of networks underground that supply compressed air to the miners that drill underground and bring the ore out. We put control in place, we put monitorability in place, and we make it so that they use less air when they need less air and more when they need more.
Like Sibanye Gold, many other industrial customers have also had to scale back on their electricity consumption to help relieve pressure on the grid. But with the IDM program being stopped, this means that the grid is once again severely constrained.
Had we continued with our program, we would have certainly had an additional 500 to 600 megawatts of saving over and above that which we've already achieved. That additional 500 megawatts would have certainly made a massive difference to the grid on many days and would have at least either avoided load shedding or would have reduced the severity of load shedding.
Eskom's renewable energy program has been a priority, but the utility has been hit by a number of unplanned maintenance issues. Financial constraints has also meant that the program will have to be put on the back burner for now. Sumitra Nadu, CCTV, Johannesburg.
Now then, 4 years after the ouster of Hosni Mubarak from power, Egypt's economy continues to struggle to get back on its feet. Public debt has hit a record level, about $280 billion. Now, after the country's political transition stabilized in 2014, business activity has risen. Shop owners and other small enterprises felt the most pressure during the last 3 turbulent years. Adel Mahrouki has been out and about assessing the recovery.
Unlike most European downtowns, in Cairo, the capital's center lacks international brand names. Most of these shops were nationalized and rented for middle and lower classes after the 1952 revolution for as much as $40 a month. So many of these are small independent businesses.
We are the real reflection. If you want to measure the speed in the Egyptian economy, the inflation, the boom or otherwise, it's truly reflected on us and from the streets.
Downtown shops were affected more than any other area in the country after the January uprising. Its main entrance is Tahrir Square. It usually locks down when there are protests.
I have been working in this shop for 40 years. Never have I seen such hard times. No one comes to the square in the weekends because it's always locked down and the main metro station has been shut down for over a year. My sales dropped by about 80%.
The impact on sales varies from one shop to the other. Many couldn't sustain the financial burdens inflicted upon them during these 4 years and were forced to shut down.
Since 2011, most small businesses have been suffering. Many say they barely broke even. But they all agree that in 2014, their sales have started to get better. And they hope in 2015, they would not go back to their normal sales, but at least come close to it.
It looks like next year will be better, of course. We're aiming to get more stock. In my field, there are many brands. Our economy is expected to grow. I predict that next year our sales will move from mainly buying watches for necessity to luxury.
Many economists have tied Egypt's political stability to economic growth. The final step in the country's democratic transition is the parliament election, which are expected in March 2015. Adel Mahroui, CCTV, Cairo.
Quick run through the markets on the last trading day of the year. Not much movement across the board, barely moving across most of the indices that we do track here for you. Some of them ending in the red, like the Egyptian EGX 30 and the Nigerian Stock Exchange All-Share Index. But for the most part, a fairly interesting year, except for Nigeria, down by about 12% so far in the year to date. What does Rastafarian culture have anything to do with business? We'll be looking at that a little later. And African winners and losers in the business world in 2014. What should you expect next year? We'll be live in London looking at that too. Africa is on the move. It's home to 7 of the world's 10 fastest growing economies. We help you make sense of the fast-changing African business landscape. We take you where the business is happening.
This report by the African Green Revolution Alliance says climate change will slash food output. Within the next 30 years, the number of malnourished people in sub-Saharan Africa could jump nearly 40%.
Welcome Welcome back to the program. You're still watching Global Business Africa. Now, Ethiopia has been home for Rastafarians who are followers of the former Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie for years. But Rastas from more than 50 nations around the world are doing a lot more than just following the religious passions in the Eastern African nation. They're now investing in small businesses, which are providing a boost to Ethiopia's economy. Girum Chala was in their hometown of Shashamane. He compiled this report.
Meet Aster Morgan, a 58-year-old Rastafarian who came to Shashamane from Trinidad and Tobago some 20 years ago to be part of the Rastafarian community here. Almaz owns this hotel in the middle of town, which employs over 25 locals.
When we come into Ethiopia, this is what the government expects of us. It expects us to contribute economically to the country because it's not a rich country. It needs help. It's rich in resources.
Shashamane, a small city in southern Ethiopia, is now home for thousands of other Rastafarians who came from all over the world. Now, almost all of the Rastas here are investing in their respective business ventures. Like others, Ras Asha Haile Selassie, who lived here for 18 years, owns a small restaurant in town.
Well, I'm selling basically fish, fried fish, rice, Caribbean style food, you know, I'm selling that. So that gives it another edge in the place, you know, it's an edge. Because there's not really that kind of quality food in place. Because the local food is based on the local ingredients, you know. So I'm trying to bring a bit of the Caribbean flavor into the food.
Rastas consider Ethiopia's former emperor Haile Selassie their god and Shashamane their home. Here, they have established everything from small businesses to religious institutions. All of the Rastas here believe they are contributing for the Ethiopian economic growth, something the locals endorse.
From when we was child to this age, we're so much comfortable, you know. We share ideas and we learn so much things, you know. Some people say Rasta only smoke, but Rasta got many things to teach to the world.
The Rastafarian society is predicted to grow over the coming 10 years, and because they are not coming to Shashamane for religious purposes alone, the city hopes to get better investment opportunities from them.
I want to see Shashamane as development in Ethiopia. It's a main place, you know, it's a cross border, it's a cross, you know. From different regions it comes to Shashamane. So it's a very important place. And right now, this here is Rasta Village.
This hotel, owned by Almaz or other businesses owned by Rastafarians in Ethiopia, gives them a rather positive role to play in the society than what they are anticipated for. Grumjala, CCTV, Shashamane, Ethiopia.
Now then, let's move on to Nigeria. It arguably had the biggest economic news in Africa coming out of it in 2014. From oil reserves to corruption to rebasing exercises, it saw it vault all the way to becoming the top and the largest economy in Africa. Of key interest, however, was the courtship of Nigeria by the United States on one hand and China on the other. Mahia Mutua has a 2014 review of the continent's economy on what's hot tonight.
2014 was the year that Nigeria overtook South Africa as the continent's biggest economy after it revised its economic output. The West African nation now has a gross domestic product of $521.8 billion thanks to impressive growth in sectors such as e-commerce, mobile phones, and its Nollywood film industry.
Without good data, it's very difficult for policymakers to assess what development challenges need to be tackled. When the data is not adequate, the policymaker is left to operate in the dark or simply to do guesswork And I think when you see the results, you see we've been doing reasonably good guesswork. But we can do better than that. And we don't want to risk solving the wrong problems because we don't have adequate information or statistics, or solving problems in the wrong way. That's why this rebasing is so important.
Nigeria, Africa's most populous country with 170 million people, has been growing as an investment destination owing to the size of its consumer market and growing capital markets. However, despite its roaring growth of recent years, Nigeria still trails South Africa, Africa's most advanced country in basic infrastructure. Power and roads necessary to lift its people out of poverty and corruption remain a major hindrance.
There is a $20 billion that has not come back. The burden of proof is on NNPC. But we have made suggestions that we question some of those explanations, and we believe that even some of that which has gone to MPDC does not belong to MPDC, but to the Federation.
On the other side of the continent, Madagascar was welcomed back into the Bretton Woods fold. The International Monetary Fund resumed ties with the Indian Ocean island nation for the first time since 2009, prompted by the peaceful elections last year.
You know, we have always had aid, but unfortunately the aid does not reach the people because it's often pocketed by those people in government.
China continued building its relationship with the continent this year, signing a raft of deals in Ethiopia, Nigeria and Angola during a continental tour by Chinese Premier Li Keqiang.
It hasn't evolved into a grown-up relationship. If you look at things like the stock market still today, 54% of the companies are owned by British companies. There is not a single Chinese stockholder that I know. The Chinese investment arm, which is the Sovereign Wealth Fund, I don't know if they've invested on the continent. So I think that is a next wave of investment that has to come from the Chinese. It's natural, but it's curious that it's taking so long, in my view, and I think that will be also a big game changer.
The United States also took a more robust approach to economic relations with Africa. In a move to boost economic ties with the continent, 50 African leaders were invited to Washington to attend a 3-day summit. While there, African leaders urged the United States to renew the African Growth Opportunity Act for 15 years, citing it would help cement trade relations and boost development in the region. The U.S. administration is keen to renew the program, but possible reforms such as adding new duty-free products, refining eligibility criteria, and tweaking regional content limits are yet to be ironed out. Mahe Mutua, CCTV.
Let's expand on that topic. Katie Gregory is live in London for us tonight. Katie, let's start with sovereign bonds here. The impending rate hikes in the US next year. Will they draw out liquidity from sovereign bonds in sub-Saharan issuers?
Well, sub-Saharan Africa has witnessed one of the greatest years in bond issuance on the international market, with nearly $15 billion sold mostly by governments from the region. That points towards the region's economic progress remaining contingent on overseas investment. If, for example, the US raises rates, well, that will attract investment back into that country when previously investors had been looking elsewhere. The increased appetite for African bonds, however, is expected to sustain demand despite that gaping deterrence that the US Fed will raise interest rates next year. There is widespread belief as well that will obviously cause volatility on international capital markets, but investors are saying that volatility will be temporary. Some are expecting Africa's issuances next year to be dominated by companies operating with the region rather than governments.
Indeed. Let's focus on one such country, Nigeria. 2014, a relatively nasty year for that country. The main index there was down about 12% by the end of the year. Aside from oil, however, what are the other main risks that investors are looking at in Nigerian assets?
Well, the Naira is in for a rough road ahead. It has been hit hard in recent months by a steep fall in the price of Nigeria's main export, oil. The rise in the dollar in heavily import-dependent Nigeria has caused pain ahead of the Christmas shopping season, with small-scale retailers saying sales were badly hit. But when it comes to overall investment, there's one really red-hot issue that investors can't ignore when it comes to Nigeria, and that is Boko Haram. Just this week, we're seeing reports of yet another attack. Suspected Islamist militants opened fire in a town in northeast Nigeria, killing at least 15 people. Now, although the attacks aren't penetrating Nigeria's centre so much, it still scares off investors and makes it logistically difficult to make Nigeria into a centre for investors to then visit, hold conferences, etc., because people will be worried about attacks at big events. The ripples the insurgency causes reach far and wide, even undermining efforts to hold Nigeria's presidential and other elections across the region in February.
Indeed. In 2008, though, Nigeria used to sell most of its oil over to the United States, but given the rise of American domestic production, it's unlikely to sell any oil at all to that country in 2015. What sort of alternative markets can Nigerian crude find a home in?
Well, yes, this is the multi-million-dollar question, really. The oil market is entering a new phase. African sellers like Nigeria and Angola, who are faced with precarious finances due to the plummeting oil prices, are struggling to make inroads into Asia. Almost half of Nigeria's cargoes due to be exported in January are actually still available, even as oil prices reach the $50 trough, which is almost $10 below Nigeria's benchmark price. The backlog has pushed the Nigerian oil differentials versus Brent to their lowest since at least 2009. But with the loss of the US market earlier this year, India has now replaced it as Nigeria's biggest buyer of the country's light crude grade. India has also taken the unusual step of asking Nigeria to offer it a 90-day credit line if it continues to buy the country's crude.
Indeed. Finally, let's move on to South Africa. Talks on a new minimum wage for mining workers. That's supposed to happen next year. How do investors on your end expect those talks to play out?
Well, hopefully quite peacefully and successfully. I think the last thing anyone wants to see, including the miners, is a repeat of those terrible strikes by platinum miners earlier in the year. It was the nation's longest running and most damaging strike before the union and mining companies came to that deal. The economy contracted by 0.6% in the first quarter, partly as a result of that strike. Remembering when they finally reached that deal in June, South Africa's currency gained 1% against the US dollar, which was a real sign of relief there by the market. The stoppage basically affected 45% of the global supply of platinum, costing the industry about 24 billion rand. So investors will be hoping the government doesn't push those miners to then strike again.
Indeed, we'll have to leave there for the time being. Katie Gregory live in London. Quick run through commodity prices here for you. We've covered some of these issues a little earlier in the conversation there with Katie. But the fact of the matter is oil is still essentially in a bout of another round of volatility. 56.55 on Brent crude. It's down about 2% or so in the last couple of minutes. We'll introduce you to a young South African entrepreneur who's brought life to traditional prints in the international fashion scene. Minutes into the program, you're still watching Global Business Africa. Now then, let's talk about fashion. The rise of globalization, improved infrastructure, and quite a few technological advancements have all changed the way Africans and pretty much everyone else around the world lives. Western trends and behavior have had an enormous impact on culture around the world, and that's most evident in the way people dress. Traditional clothing and ethnic print, especially in Africa, tend to hold less appeal, especially for the younger generation. But one young entrepreneur in South Africa is trying to change that with his traditionally inspired garments that fuse culture from tradition with modern fashion.
I am Latuma Ngokolo, born and raised in Port Elizabeth.
When I was age 16, my late mother taught me how to hand machine knit. I was at grade 8 at that time. We went out looking for a TV set because we didn't have a TV set back home. And fortunately, my mother came across a knitting machine and we ended up going back home with that. So I became very enthusiastic. I wanted to know how to use the machine, how the machine works, and I ended up helping her to make knitwear. Since then, I've been making knitwear garments and actually developing other pieces. I wanted to create something which sort of solved a problem that I actually discovered amongst us as Xhosa people. There are about 8 million Xhosa people in South Africa. Traditionally, Xhosa boys between aged 18 to 25 go through a manhood circumcision, and before they go through that ritual, they have to give away all their old clothes, and that means buying a whole new wardrobe. And so I decided to develop a knitwear collection which carries those aesthetics, and made my own patterns which I make sure that they would be modern enough to actually be appealing to Xhosa initiates who are influenced by international trends. The Abatembo, they use a lot of blues in their beadwork. So I take some of those color combinations and actually play around with in my knitwear. And these are some of the motifs which I actually took from traditional Xhosa beadwork and actually modified them to be suitable for these type of modern garments. The material that I actually use for the knitwear is purely South African. The garments are made from 80% South African merino wool and 20% South African mohair, which are very fine fibers. I go for the finest fibers because I want a very soft handwear. I supply about 3 boutiques locally: Cape Town, Joburg, and Port Elizabeth, my home. And now I'm actually exploring more overseas because knitwear consumption is bigger overseas. Some of the response that I get from people, they like my pieces because it is African and also quite modern at the same time. Amsterdam is my biggest potential market because I have a lot of interest that comes from there. So I'll be supplying a retailer that will be selling directly to the market in Amsterdam. I guess because they love their Scandinavian patterns, which is sort of similar or speaks the same language as that. I am looking at going overseas to study at the Central St. Martins to study textile futures. Textile futures is a course that explores and interrogates future innovations within textiles and material science as well. I want to make sure that by the time future innovations hit Africa or the globe, I am very well aware and prepared for that. South Africa is where I want to end up ultimately, but I obviously need all the knowledge and resources to be well settled and sit here knowing that I have a growing brand.
And that's it for this edition of Global Business. We'd like to hear what you think about what we've been doing so far in 2014. Global Business Africa @cctv.com is the email address to use. Facebook and Twitter, of course, are always avenues and ports of call for you as well. Whatever you're doing over the new year, have fun with it. See you tomorrow.